Good day, everyone. The International Parking and Mobility Institute is pleased to present the webinar entitled Micromobility and Parking, First and Last Mile Options and What They Mean for Your Operation. My name is Justin, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Please note that all participants' lines will be muted during the session. If you need assistance at any time during the program, please raise your hand or use the chat box on the left side of the screen. Today's presentation will last 60 minutes and will include a specific question and answer period. However, you can queue up a question for us at any time during today's presentation. To enter a question through the webinar system, simply type your question in the chat box on the left side of the screen and click send. These instructions will be repeated later in the program. All participants will receive an archived version of this presentation in a few days. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Nathan Donnell, CAP, is an innovative technology strategist who comes up with fresh ideas and new systems in the parking and mobility industry. Nathan is the director of Curbside Management Solution for Conduit and has 15 years of experience in the parking and transportation industry. He has an extensive experience working with municipalities, universities, and private operators to enhance their parking programs with the use of technology that makes parking and transportation more efficient. Nathan attended Grand Canyon University, where he majored in business management. Nathan, welcome to the program. The audience is all yours.
Thank you so much, Justin. And thank you all for joining this webinar to discuss micromobility and how it can relate to your specific operations. So before we get started, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that knowing that we're in this time that we are in right now, hopefully this next hour that we share together, that we can just kind of put our mind at ease and just focus on something other than what the world's going through. So my thoughts and prayers are for everybody that's on this call and everybody else as well. But I want to just kind of begin by saying we're all in this together, and we'll continue to grow through this whole entire process. So I've been tasked to be a part of the IPMI Technology Committee. It's been a fantastic committee. There's a number of committees that IPMI offers. The Technology Committee is a committee that is near and dear to my heart because I'm kind of a technology nerd when it comes to parking. As Justin said, I've been in the parking industry for 15 years now, and I've seen it change tremendously over the last 15 years. And for those that are on this call that have been in it longer than I, then you've actually seen it grow even more than I have. But part of these committees gives us the ability and the opportunity to kind of expand our horizons when it comes to technology and what our industry has to offer today. So if you have not had the opportunity to get involved in any of the technology or any committee that IPMI offers, I strongly suggest that you check them out, because there's a number of them that really, really do some really cool things. So kind of moving forward, the agenda today is basically on micromobility, the first and last miles, and what are the benefits of micromobility, what are the considerations when actually looking at different micromobility options, and then how to implement a micromobility program and or programs, depending on what it is. And then we'll finish off with the APDS, which is the data standard that IPMI and others have come together and are trying to bring as a technology and data in general for our industry to be more of a standardization. Wow, that word is really tough for me right now. Anyways, we're going to standardize the data that we all do, whether it's third-party vendors and or municipalities, universities, and private operators. So kind of jumping right into the presentation itself. We all know parking is not what it used to be. I thought this was kind of a funny cartoon that we put in here. So true, when it comes to us as parking and technology and parking and transportation industry itself, our lives will revolve around parking and putting vehicles where they need to go and finding enough parking or figuring out ways to essentially park cars. But that's changing over the course of the last 10 years. We used to focus on parking and improving that experience, but now today we're moving forward, and now we're not only talking about parking, but we're talking about curbside management, we're talking about micromobility options, we're talking about what different uses of the curb in general. And so it's always changing. And so we feel as a committee that we want to continue at the forefront of that change and make sure that we get all of this information out to you all so you can make educated decisions on your operations itself. Very interesting statistic on this slide here is that you see mobility access is an accelerating change. 60% of trips in the United States are 0 to 5 miles. Whether that's through a micromobility, whether it's through scooters, bikes, even vehicles, a lot of our trips are really short trips, whether you're going to the grocery store, whether you're going to the gas station or the school to pick up your kids. They're much smaller trips. You can see here 25% are right in that 5 and 15 mile range. Some of those are including the Ubers and Lyfts of the world. So we have our ride hailing or taxis. And then, of course, the long distance trips that you may be able to take. And I say long distance, it's 15 miles or over. But you can see here that there are options to be able to use some sort of a mobility, whether it's car to go, get around, different things like that, where you can actually go in and share a car, or you have your own vehicle. I thought this was fascinating because I tend to take advantage or not really think about when I drive and when I do the different things, but I was out running errands yesterday and I took 3 trips and all of them were in that 0 to 5 mile range. And so it really does kind of hone into that type of mobility or transportation range that we have. And so as an operation, whether it's a municipality or a university or just even a private operator, these are the kind of things that we really want to kind of hone into to understand how we actually work and run our operations as an organization. So what is micromobility? Micromobility is, I would say it's a new term when it comes to today's parking and transportation. Micromobility refers to the use of whether it's an electronic scooter or regular scooter or a bike or an e-bike to travel shorter distances around cities, university campuses, or just campuses in general, often to and from another mode of transportation, whether it's bus, train, car. Users typically rent a scooter or a bike or use their own scooter or bike or some sort of form of transportation for a short period of time, and then most likely if you're using a shared micromobility service, you are using that service through an app. So whether it's a Lyft app or a Bird app or a City Bike app, you're starting a transaction through that app to essentially rent that particular product in a micromobility session. So one of the things that you can see here on the screen that is gone crazy over the last probably, I would say 4 to 5 years, it was actually introduced in Santa Monica. I actually was working, my office was in Santa Monica when the first e-scooter was dropped into that city. And I remember going to the office and then walking to lunch one day, and I passed all these scooters, and I was like, what? I asked myself, like, what is this? So there wasn't any, I didn't see any marketing, I didn't see a news blast, I didn't see anything. In my mind, they were just kind of dropped in, and people just, through the use of technology, just started to understand how to use them. I would say that, again, being 4 or 5 years ago, I would say that it could have been done differently. And I know that over the last 4 or 5 years, it has been done differently. But again, that's kind of how it was introduced. It was really just kind of dropped in our laps, and most municipalities and universities and private operators said, okay, what are we going to do with this? Excuse me. So these e-scooters have just gone crazy over the last 4 or 5 years, and I know that in certain cities, and I can use like Austin, for example, that Austin has 9 different scooter operators, or at least it did when I was there about a year ago, operating within the city limits. And there are hundreds of scooters at any given point in time, whether it's on a street corner or near a bus stop or near a commuter station. There are scooters everywhere. And so you have the ability, whether or not you're using them for recreation or you're using them to get from one place to another, for a purpose, whether it's to go to lunch or go to your office, or to even go home if you live in an urban environment. These scooters and or forms of transportation are there for your use. Bikes and e-bikes. So there's a number of bike sharing services out there. One of the biggest ones being in New York City. They are a docked bike sharing program that New York City has partnered up with City Bike, and it is a very successful program that the City of New York has done. We won't get into the details of what New York has done, but if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer those either offline or after this about that type of a solution. There are also bike sharing places that actually have dockless bikes. So you can see on one of the screenshots here that there are bikes that you can just walk up to and pick up. It's not in the docked area. Typically, you would find them in an app, and if you have your geolocation turned on, you can see that where the bikes are at and if they're available to rent or start your transaction. In a shared or in a docked location, it's a much easier location to find. You typically see these dock locations. These docked stations are probably in what used to be a parking space on a curb or in a parking lot or even in a parking garage. We've seen those as well. So there's a number of different ways and different programs and different opportunities to be able to use these different types of bikes and or e-bike solutions. There's other active transportation forms that are either out there now or in the future may be available. So we talked about like medical transport operations. So we have transportation, small buses or small vans that are considered in this quote-unquote micromobility where they're doing that 0 to 5 miles that you may have to manage and or operate in your facilities. We can't forget the traditional walking. So there are a number of different things that people don't use these micro-mobility options. They will actually walk. Do you actually, as your operations are, if you think about your operations, do you have adequate sidewalk or walking paths that are safe, that are available to people that are actually walking? I know there are some places throughout North America that may have sidewalks on one side of the street and not on the other. Is it easily accessible? Is it safe? I mean, that's the biggest thing. Of course, we have bicycles and e-bikes. Skateboards on university campuses seem to be a big one. We'll go through the list here shortly. And, last but definitely not least, we have pogo sticks. And, kind of a joke, but this is actually a real company that is a startup company that is offering pogo sticks as a form of transportation. I don't know about you all, but that would be a really tough way to get around more than about 50 feet. Because I remember as a kid being on a pogo stick. Takes a lot of effort and energy to do it, but it's fun. And then again, we have this kind of a futuristic idea of drones and air taxis and different things. Like these are things that seem very, very far off in the future, but these are kind of things that we probably need to think about and what is happening in this world that we live in, especially when it comes to mobility and transportation. Things happen so quickly and so fast. I mean, who would have thought 5 years ago that scooters e-scooters or e-bikes or bikes in general would just inundate our campuses and our universities and our cities and or even Uber and Lyft. So knowing that you kind of look at that slide and you say, oh, there's a drone there going to pick me up. There's no way that's ever going to happen. It very much could happen in the future. And I'm not saying that it wouldn't. I really do believe that there comes a point in time, maybe not in our life, but in our kids and our grandkids' life, this will actually happen. So we have to, as an organization and as an industry, need to start thinking about different ways of looking about our active transportation. So micromobility in your parking operation, kind of start getting the meat of the different things of how we're planning for mobility. Maybe some of you on this call have already implemented some sort of a mobility or a micromobility plan and or solution into your operations. And maybe others have not yet. But these are things to think about even if you have them in place now and you're struggling to figure out how to make it more efficient. There are a number of campuses, as you can see here, like they have skateboard racks or like almost lockup racks. Instead of taking your skateboard into class, you can actually put your skateboard on this rack and lock it up for safety reasons. Campuses all over the country are offering this type of a bike rack or a solution that you can offer your students and or visitors there. You can see here one of the slides actually has a parking space that has a couple of e-scooters in there. Knowing that that's not an e-scooter parking spot, but this is the kind of things that people see all the time. Like, why are scooters parked in a parking space? Why are they not parked in a designated spot? Do you offer designated spots? Do you remove traditional parking spaces and allow for bikes and scooters to park in a space like that? Is the space given the ability for safety and or revenue purposes, is that feasible? Like, those are the kind of things as an operator that you could be thinking of. Bottom right-hand corner of this slide is actually a picture that I took when I was over in Europe doing some business travel, and that happens to be a movie theater. You can see there that those are bikes in front of the movie theater. This is a very bike-driven city that I was in, and they have really placed the operations around that type of mobility. And so, again, these are all kinds of things you can think about and different things that you're looking at as you're trying to decrease congestion and decrease vehicles on the street or in the campus. Do you try to really push this form of transportation within your operations themselves, as well as offering the ability to give you essentially a bike and or scooter parking space on your curb? And if you do put it on your curb, do you allow vehicles to park on one side of the curb, which is the street side, and do you allow the bikes park on the other? Is that a feasible way of doing things? Or is that an efficient way of doing things because of the space that you may or may not have? These are all things that you really, really want to think about when you're implementing and or tweaking your current mobility solution that you have on campus today. A huge thing that I think that is really important is training your staff to move people. Mobility lanes, are your mobility lanes walking and bike lanes at the same time? Is that safe to do? Or do you have enough space where you can put a bike lane in one area and a walking lane right next to it? Do you look at non-traditional curb management? So curb management is so different than what it was even 5 years ago. We always talked about managing our curb on the street side. Now we have to manage our curb on both sides. How do you manage that curb? How do you create an efficient and or safe way of utilizing that space? Do you train your staff on what type of mobility services that you offer? There are people that will call and or reach out to a city and or university when they have a challenge with whatever mobility solution is out there. Do you have the ability to answer their questions? Or do you rely on a third-party vendor to answer those questions? Those are all the things that you really need to think about. And then how do you understand the partnering offerings? Like what's happening when a vendor drops in scooters and or bikes into your area? Do you understand exactly how that works? Do they utilize the locations that you want to have? We're going to talk about geofencing. We're going to talk about all kinds of different things, but these are things that as a staff, we need to be sure that we understand that. We need to know exactly what's going on within our cities and or campuses. So this use case happens to be one that will give you the ability here to connect the suburban areas to the urban areas, where someone and or person or visitor or student can park into a commuter lot and or ride their bike or ride some form of transportation into a commuter lot, lock up their bikes or park their bikes, and then get on a train or get on some form of bus, something like that, to be able to kind of get into the city itself. And then once they're in the city, they have all of these different options that they can get into, or campus. They have all these different options. They can either walk, They can take another ride sharing. They can take another bus, a short-term bus, bike, scooter, even a taxi. Now, do you have the ability to connect all of these dots together? I've spoken to many cities that are trying to figure out how do we create a first and last mile operations where we don't, as a municipality or government agency, where we don't actually have to budget for the expense of adding more buses or adding some sort of transportation where we can bring in a third party and they can kind of fill that gap. And those are kind of things that we need to think about when we're looking at this thing, because ultimately scooters and bikes are fun, but they are a form of transportation that gets us to point A to point B. And it's not just for recreation, it actually is for moving people from one point to another. User case number 2, city garages. So this is something that is happening more and more in urban areas where you look at the different ways of how you can actually use your garage. I know right now the city of Las Vegas is actually taking some of their city-owned garages and utilize them at the bottom level for Uber and Lyft ride-sharing pickup and drop-off areas. Instead of actually picking up on the curb and dropping off on the curb, they're actually allowing Uber and Lyft to stage in areas. We know that airports have been doing this for a while now, but these are kind of things that we can think about doing on our campuses. Can we take a section of a garage in a safe manner where we can block it off and put some sort of a micromobility hub, so to speak? So if you park your car in that garage and then you go and grab a scooter or a bike and then take it to lunch or take it to the office or take it to class, do you have a space in that garage that you can do that? Is it a space that can be utilized in a manner that is going to continue to build revenue? So these are all different things, because if you're pulling out parking spaces, traditional parking spaces that have a revenue tied to it, how do you backfill the revenue that is there? How do you increase or decrease scooter usage in certain areas? Because there are certain areas there that maybe some scooters will be used and other scooters will be not used. On weekends or at night, when maybe your garage is in a location where it's only used during the day for, classes and or offices, can you use that garage, those same spaces, to be able to use it as a hub, whether it's for a ride sharing or for a scooter staging or a bike staging area? These are all the things that we want you to start thinking about when either utilizing micromobility or adding more micromobility services within your organization itself. The benefits of micromobility: providing better connection to public transit. I think that is one of the things that a lot of the third-party vendors discuss when they drop in micromobility into your locations. But how do you make sure that that actually happens, right? How do these vehicles get to a place in the morning when someone's riding a bus into the city? Are those vehicles and or scooters or bikes, are they there for the riders to go and then take them to the office? And then are they at the office for when they can ride back to that transit location? Does it really reduce the reliance on personal vehicles? Like, do these different things actually make sense? And it cuts greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, that's kind of, in my mind, a no-brainer. When you're using an electric form or a person-powered form of transportation, you're not using a vehicle that is actually creating this greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think that there are more and more studies out there that are showing that these types of services are, in fact, reducing the emissions that we have. Potential revenue. We can't get lost on this. There's a number of different ways that you can actually get revenue for having these micromobility options within your operations. So there are some cities and or campuses that offer license fees per scooter and or bike, and it's a flat fee per year that they charge the vendor to do so. There are others that are working on like a per ride fee, where per ride fees go in and say, okay, well, I'm going to charge the third-party vendor a fee to every single time that scooter and or bike gets used. And then you have the ability to take a portion of that fee when a person does that. Or a totally different idea that I know some states are looking at is an idle fee. How long are those scooters and bikes sitting there without being used? And it's just like a vehicle. When a vehicle is parked and it's not being used, we're charging for parking in an on-street or even an off-street location. Can you charge your micromobility services and or third-party vendors a fee to do that? And then how do you do citations? Like, do your citation providers and or vendors have the ability to create a citation for a bike and or a scooter that somehow gets back to the actual rider? And there's ways that you can do that through your enforcement provider and or your third-party vendor. So these are all forms of revenue that you can actually discuss and or talk about when implementing and or adding services. So consumer choices, I thought this was kind of a cute cartoon here. This is so true for even my kids and myself right here. So there's not any scooters left, we'll have to walk. We'll walk. Is there an app for that? Everything is app-driven today, technology-driven in general. We want to give our consumers a number of choices. Do we need to have 9 different scooter companies and or bike companies, or is it sufficient to only have 3? How do you pick the scooter companies and or vendors to be able to offer their services within your organization? Is it an RFP process? Is it a permitting process that we allow as many as possible? We're going to limit the number of units that are on our streets or on our campus. These are all things that you want to think about. I know there's a number of places out there that you can pull from, so you don't actually have to reinvent the wheel that's there. Consumer choice enables a better use of infrastructure. So you can see here that increases the value of your parking facility. If you like, so for example, when I talked about the city of Las Vegas, more and more people were not driving, and so the garages were sitting there half empty in certain situations or certain times of the day. And so the city turned around and said, okay, well, we can utilize this solution and utilize these areas and still get a form of revenue for it, and also get the congestion off the street and people idling and waiting. And so this is the reason why these are kind of things you should think about. Does it increase traffic to your facility? So if you have an off-street parking lot or a garage that maybe people don't use for vehicles, but you can get them to actually use it for some sort of a micromobility process, but then they realize, oh, this is also a place I can park my car. So in future trips or different things, they actually know that there's a garage there or a location there that they can park their vehicle in. Attract other services, food trucks, advertising. Like, can you utilize these different things when you're taking vehicles off the street and replacing them with this form of transportation? Can you offer more services? Food trucks are a big thing nowadays, and it's not just the old roach coach. When I grew up and I was in construction, when the roach coach would drive into the thing, it wasn't a food truck. It was, be careful what you eat there. Now there are Michelin star chefs that are running food trucks. And so these are ways that we can actually increase revenue and or just people coming into either our campuses and or our cities to be able to just enlighten or enhance their experience. Do you have the ability to create mobility lanes? I mean, you can see here, this picture is actually from Santa Monica. I can tell you 5 years ago, there was no mobility lanes in Santa Monica. But they have since done that because they have seen such an increased use of micromobility, bikes, even just people riding their own bikes. And it's much safer when you have that type of a lane rather than just riding in the same exact lane as a vehicle. Do you allow your scooters to be ridden on the sidewalk? That's a safety issue. I know there are cities like the city of Denver that does not allow that. You have to share the street with the vehicles. Is that safe? Or do you have the ability to create a bike lane in that area? Or on certain campuses, can you shut off an entire street and make it a mobility street instead of a bike or instead of a car or vehicle? I know campuses are doing that and looking at ways to actually get vehicles off of their campus and utilize other forms of transportation. Loading and unloading zones. Do those loading and unloading zones, do those zones themselves actually hinder the mobility lanes? Or do you have the ability to take a loading zone and put it into an area where mobility lanes are not? Dedicated parking locations. Are they clearly marked? Whether it's on the street or off the street, are those locations actually marked where people understand exactly where they can park or where they can't park? And we can't forget this. I mean, it's fun. I don't know if anybody has written on these things before or utilized them, but I know I have in many different cities and or locations throughout the country, and they are fun. They're a great time. And on the fun factor, you got to think of all of these different things. Are you just utilizing these things for fun, or are you utilizing them to actually solve a problem? And there's nothing wrong with them being fun and utilizing them that way, but you also want to try to solve a problem that you may have or a challenge that you may have. When considering your micromobility, safety is, I think, key. More than anything, you need to figure out if it's even feasible on a safety aspect of it. There have been a number of news reports come out over the last couple of years of accidents and or even unfortunate deaths because of people using these forms of transportation. Whether or not it's the user error or it's just because of where they have been utilized, those things happen. Are you in a location where weather conditions play a role? Or do you have snow, 4 or 5 months out of the year? Do you put in some sort of situation in your contract with these third-party vendors where you say from October to February, you need to essentially pick these things up, store them somewhere else, and then drop them back out when the weather goes away, when the snow melts, and they have the ability to either put them back in place and or people can start using them in a safe manner. Going back again, a helmet policy. This is a big one. I know that most, if not every, third-party vendor, when you click on, I agree to the terms and conditions, one of those terms and conditions is I will wear a helmet and I will advise or adhere to all the rules and regulations. But do you enforce that? Or is it the responsibility of the rider to either have a helmet or not have a helmet? These are all things that are a huge consideration when implementing and or continuing the services that you currently have. Safeties, helmets. Can you park in a location where it's not a tripping hazard? You can see in some of these things where there's the right hand picture there shows a scooter. It's in a spot where there may not be a tripping hazard there. It's actually neatly placed. But then you have the bottom left-hand corner of the slide where you see one that's tipped over. There's a number of them I've seen in cities where they're all over the place. Who do you punish, or who do you try to create some sort of a policy where people actually have to keep those things standing up, where you as an enforcement provider, is it your responsibility to go out there and make sure those things are parked in the right location? And if you are as an enforcement provider, do you actually charge the third-party vendor for doing what could be considered their job or their responsibility? These are all things that we need to think about. Then, of course, like the legal business area has popped up. More and more lawyers and law firms are looking at opportunities here to go and capitalize on these scooters and or bikes. And so all these things in consideration when you're really thinking about implementing a service. Limited infrastructure. This is huge for most people that I talk to in our industry. College campuses are not expanding campuses. They're actually removing parking spaces for buildings. And it's a huge challenge for the parking and transportation departments of university campuses to figure out not only where to put cars, but now to put these other forms of transportation. Like, what do you do with those situations? Like, do you create where there was once a green space, does that now become a different space for this type of micromobility? You need a strategic plan when talking about it. There are if you do not put a plan in place, chaos will reign. I mean, that's huge. We're seeing that today in other forms. So we need to really kind of put something and think about the different ways of doing it. I talked about the city of Austin and the fact that they have as many scooter companies there. They are working with every third-party vendor there to basically lessen the quote-unquote chaos on what the scooter companies and or bike companies do, because they want to give their visitors options to be able to go from one place in the city to another, but they need to do it in a safe and effective manner. Again, going back to, can you remove assets? Can you take on-street parking spaces and put them for bike and or scooter parking? Will you recover the lost revenue? Or is the cost of doing business? Because you feel like that if I lose $300 a month or $500 a month in this space that provides, I'm throwing numbers out there, it could be much more than that, and adding this service or adding this location, will it basically meet the needs that I have? So the cost of doing business, does that work for you and your operations? Are you solving your challenges, or are you just moving them to a different thing? So the challenges 10 years ago was, how do I park cars? And how do I do it efficiently? And how do I do it in a manner that people don't get frustrated? Goes to now, how do I manage not only parking cars, but how do I help manage my mobility services in my locations? Do I hire different types of positions that maybe I didn't have to hire before? Are your enforcement officers now ambassadors, where they can go in and actually help people on the streets and walk around and make sure they answer questions, make sure people sign up correctly, make sure people are using them correctly? I know there's our cities that I've been in where they actually have taken their enforcement officers and really kind of changed some of their job descriptions to be more of an ambassador, where they're looked at as a positive and not necessarily as the negative of all this person wants to do is write me a ticket. There are benefits for using these micromobility services. We just need to make sure that there are spaces and or locations where these services are actually not only efficient, but of course safe. Because the underlying issue in this whole entire thing is it safe? Will these things be a temporary fix? Will they go away in the next 3 to 5 years? We've seen it today. Over the last 6 months, there has been a couple of different third-party vendors that have removed their assets and or bikes and scooters from a location because the revenue model wasn't in place or the backlash was too much. Will they come back if you offer a different type of solution? Like, those are things that it's yet to be seen. We just need to discuss and continue to put something in place where, if they do come back, can we put something in, or can we kind of take the contract that we have in place right now and modify it in a manner that's going to help both the third-party vendor and the municipality and or university campus or even private operation? Because both parties need to benefit from this. Whether it's a revenue, we know on one side, on the third-party vendor, revenue is big, and then the capture of data is their two main components. But on the other side, revenue may not be the biggest thing. It may be safety, it may be awareness, it may be getting that point A to point B from a major transportation like a bus station and or commuter train to into a city and or campus where you may not want to be able to or have the funds to be able to offer some sort of other transportation in place. So how do we adopt micromobility? I think that if you don't have a micromobility service in place right now, you're in a great place, because you can learn from what other agencies have done, whether it's good and or bad, and take those things and utilize them in yours. If you do have them in place, can you learn from others in our industry and or from things like this, where you can start to see your objectives and goals and then refine them? I know I'm working with a city right now that has had a micromobility third-party vendors, a number of them throughout their city, for about 3 or 4 years, and they're going back now and saying, okay, this is the data that we've received, these are the things that we've learned from this, and we want to sit down with you and refine these different goals. We need to meet certain goals And in certain areas, we've met them. In other areas, we have not. And so how do we work together at creating the most efficient mobility or transportation hub out there or places? You need to understand your users' needs. Are the users just using them for fun? Are they just using them to boot around the city and have a good time? Or are they using them to actually get to a destination? I myself have done both. I have used them for fun. I've been in cities where I've never been in that city before, and instead of walking around or taking some sort of a taxi or ride sharing, I have actually gone and rented these things and then booted around the city and saw a lot of different places and a lot of different things. That's great. But is that what they're there for? Or are they there to get you from point A to point B? And if they are they in place where a person doesn't have to walk a half mile out of the way just to get on one to go a mile? That may not meet the needs of your users. And again, understanding your infrastructure and your other constraints, those are things as individual operations you need to understand, because as a university campus, maybe your constraints, your infrastructure, your challenges may be completely different than the challenges that a municipality has. Or you may have to have a coordinated effort between the two. If you're in a municipality, your university campus sits in a municipality, can you work together at creating a all-in-one type of a component? And then, of course, who benefits from that? So you have to define those rules. And then again, how do you enforce them? How do you enforce those rules? Do you have enforcement officers that are not just writing tickets for vehicles like they were 5 years ago? Now they're writing some sort of a citation or some sort of a ticket for these e-bikes, scooters, e-scooters. And of course, the overcrowding. I think this is probably key in a lot of different cities, is how many units do you need and or do you have before it comes this guerrilla approach where everything is just dropped in and there's 500 units out there and only an average of 150 are getting used per day. Do you back them off? Do you say, I know that I told you you can't have more than 500, but we probably need to revisit this. And these are all strategies that you need to look at either in implementation and or ongoing. More things to consider is geofencing. There are campuses and there are cities out there today that will geofence areas where they basically say there is no e-bikes or scooters allowed in this area. And when that scooter or bike gets in that area, it basically shuts down. It stops, the power gets shut off to it. An alarm goes off. As a user, do you then all of a sudden just drop them right there, or do you put them in a place of safety where people aren't going to be tripping over them? Do you create low speed areas? In an area that is being shared with walking and or bike paths, do you have a low speed area where you want people to slow down? These third-party vendors that offer these e-scooters and e-bikes actually have the ability to put those types of limits on these things. So do you work with them and make sure that it's there? Prohibited areas. I also know there are campuses and cities that say there's absolutely nothing allowed in this area. This is only for vehicles. This is only for people walking. You have to think about those things. And again, going back to the enforcement, I think this is key because people are still trying to wrap their heads around this. How do we enforce this? If I don't see the person getting off the scooter and dropping it into an area where it's prohibited, but I need to somehow punish and or create some sort of a policy that says either the vendor and or the person riding that form of transportation gets some sort of a citation or a warning. Do you have your vendor moving the bikes and scooters at peak times? Are they going around your city and saying, okay, we need to move them into the transit stations they need to be there by 7 o'clock in the morning? Not just to get them charged, but actually removing or relocating those things into areas where they're going to be utilized in an efficient and or enough of them there where people can actually get from point A to point B more effectively. And then, of course, the lower income housing areas or areas where there may not be some sort of a bus route or certain things. Do you utilize these things to fill that gap? Do you give them the same access? Do you give them discounts if they utilize if you start a session in a lower income or an area that may not have some sort of a transportation area that's there right now. Revenue models. Again, we've talked about revenue models. Is it a license per unit? Do you offer that on an annual basis? Do you do the parking rates where you can do an idle time? I know there's, again, pilots going out there right now today that are looking at if scooters are sitting there for longer than a half an hour, they will be charged a fee of some sort back to the scooter company. Do you give them discount pricing for different zones and different lower demand areas where they may not be utilized as much? And again, do you not charge them for the idle time, but you charge them a per ride or per transaction session? So if they're charging $5 for that transaction, you get a portion of that, which is essentially a revenue share. How do you utilize your revenue models? There are many forms and different ways that you can look at doing this. It's just looking at your operations in general and seeing what will work best for you. Micromobility and data. Data is huge, right? This is where I think that the rubber meets the road. You need to understand your data and your gross revenue, the number of trips being used, from point A to point B. How do you get that data? Do you license that data from the third-party vendors? How do you analyze that data? Do you have people on staff that actually have the ability to analyze that data? Is the data that you're receiving from your third-party vendors that are offering these solutions, is the data that you're receiving readable data? If it's not, those are things you have to talk about. A lot of the times, I've seen some of this data, and a lot of the times this data is very difficult to read unless you have some sort of a data scientist or some sort of third-party data tool that you can ingest that data and then spit it out in a readable measure. Is this data protected for just not being able to get someone's personal information? That's another really big thing. Third-party vendors are absolutely trying to hold on to the customer data and make sure that these cities and or universities don't have access to the personal data, but they do want to give them data from point A to point B. So how do you get that objective? And then you got to use that data to make the decisions. Like, you have to use that data to say, okay, do I have too many bikes and or scooters on the street or on my campus today? How do I pull them back? How do I have those conversations? These are all the things that you have to do. Are you publishing data for public use? Are they on your website? Is Google, Waze, Uber, Lyft, are they pushing that data out to the consumer? Make sure you understand that there's other third parties like Google, Waze, Lyft, and Uber that will publish this data for you at no cost. So make sure that you understand that that's available. And then standardized data is very key. You need to make sure that data is readable and it's legible. So that kind of gets into our APDS, which is the very last form of this presentation, where APDS is the American Parking Data Standards. So their IPMI has worked with a number of different institutes and associations around the world, specifically over in Europe, where they've partnered up with the European Parking Association and the British Parking Association to create a data standard for our industry. This will help when talking about what kind of vendors you have, whether it's a parking hardware vendor or an app provider, and there's integrations that have to be met between the two. Is that data standardized where that integration becomes much easier? Can you use different out-of-the-box automotive industry, IT areas? Can you use the same type of data feeds to easily integrate with these different providers? That's what the APDS standards are doing today. I'm really excited to say that I was a part of this originally when the data standards came out. It's key to be able to do something like this, because anybody on this call knows when you start working with different vendors, those different vendors that may write their code in one computer language and then another vendor writes a code in another computer language, it's very difficult to mirror those things together or connect those two together. The APDS is actually causing this to make it much easier for you to work with that. And so you can see the different phases and developments here. You have place, rate, occupancy, right, session, and again, not without getting into this for the time's sake here, these are all the things that are being phased in currently. Locations. Are those GPS locations all the same standardized data? Do you have rates? Are those rates changing so much that that data needs to be pushed out on an hourly basis? With this APDS, you have the ability to do stuff like that. Occupancy data, availability, what type of data are you using and how are you pushing it out and how frequently are you doing it? Curbside management, what location is a red zone and or loading zone compared to a parking zone? Is that changing constantly, or is that a set type of a data set that's out there? With APDS, you have the ability to kind of change that today. And then steps the adoptions, operations and different things you need to go through in this. You provide a timeline, you implement the data specification and procurement process. So I can foresee in the future that this data will be available and be written into different RFPs that come out and says, if you are a vendor, it's required that you are part of this APDS. As a municipality, as a university, you will help drive the APDS to be more and more of a norm for our industry. So where to find more information on APDS? Here are all the information, as Justin said in the very beginning of this, is that there are links to this information in these documents. Please get involved, read them. There's always these question and answer periods. The more people we have getting involved in this, the better it is and the more robust it is. So please get involved, ask the questions, reach out to one of us. Rachel Yoka's on here with IPMI. She'll be able to help you with this as well. That's the end of the webinar. I hate to cut it off. I know that we have about 5 or 6 minutes left for questions and answers, but I do appreciate your time today, and hopefully this gave you something to think about when it talks about your micromobility and what options you have out there.
All right. Thank you, Nathan. So we are ready for our first question and answer segment of the webinar. You may type your question into the chat on the left side of the screen and click send, and we will get to as many questions as we have time to get to. Any that we are unable to answer, we will send to all participants in a follow-up email. So the first question is do you have any thoughts about micromobility solutions under solar canopy structures with EV chargers and the governmental and utility programs to get funds for that?
It's a great question. So I know that traditional EV charging stations for vehicles is utilizing the solar canopies as a form of power. And I can see that right now I have not seen any third-party e-scooters or e-bikes utilize solar, at least in areas that I have seen in North America. But I think this is a huge possibility to be able to do something like that because it's really difficult sometimes to get power in those situations. I know right now, when you're talking about e-scooters, most of these third-party vendors are picking up e-scooters at night, taking them to a charging station or a charging location, and then dropping them off in the morning. But if you had some sort of a charging station that's actually readily available for the consumer and or the public, that they can park a vehicle there and then it gets charged up, you're killing two birds with one stone. So I do think that it's a huge opportunity. I have not seen it yet, but I think that there's a way of utilizing that.
All right. The next question is, has any cities or universities seen the benefits of having micromobility as a form of transportation?
I have seen many cities and universities actually benefit from this. There are, without calling out the cities in general, but there are a number of different cities that have actually been able to work with third-party vendors to realign or move these forms of transportation over to bus hubs, commuter stations, and then get people to actually use them in the morning, and then, of course, realign them or remove them back in the evening. So they're there for people to actually get to and from their point A to point B. And so I do think that it's not just out there for fun. There's a lot of fun to be had, but I do think this is a legitimate use of transportation where it's actually not eliminating, but reducing the burden on either campuses and or municipalities to offer different forms of transportation where they may not have the budget for.
All right. And looks like we just have time for one more question. How do cities and universities enforce people and micromobility vendors?
Another great question. So there are a number of ways that I've seen this actually happen. So there are enforcement providers out there that, of course, write tickets for vehicles that are illegally parked or they've they've overstayed their parking session, whatever the case may be, those enforcement vendors also have the ability to write a citation or create some sort of a fine for a scooter. Now, the scooter companies and or bike companies, it's their responsibility to either go back and charge the parker for that. Most bike and scooter companies, when you get done with a session, you actually take a picture of that vehicle and or scooter or bike to say that it's parked in a space that's not either a tripping hazard or on the street or laid down. And so there's that form of verification there. And so ultimately it comes back to is, yes, you can write a ticket or create some sort of citation to the vendor, maybe not the person itself, but that vendor, then it's their responsibility to either charge it back to the customer that rode that scooter or bike and then have them pay it, or they pay it on behalf of them. So it really is up to them.
All right. Nathan, do you have any final thoughts for the audience?
No, again, I just want to thank everybody for their time today. It's been a great hour. I've given you a lot of things to consider and talk about. You're more than happy to reach out to me and other people on the technology committee that helped put this presentation together. I think the micromobility is not here, it may not be here to stay, but there will be forms of micromobility transportation that come and go throughout a progress in the future. But ultimately, we as an industry need to make sure we're on top of it.
All right. Well, at this time, we must conclude today's presentation. A special thanks to Nathan for being with us here today. We look forward to having you join us for IPMI's next webinar, More Than a Parking Garage, Transformative Leadership to Shift Campus Culture. Today's webinar is copyrighted in 2020 by the International Parking and Mobility Institute with all rights reserved. Thank you for joining us today. This concludes today's presentation. You may now disconnect.
Thank you.